Hey y'all, let's sew up a Judy Tee. What you need to make sure you cut out is one front, one back, two sleeves that are mirror image. You can cut them with fabrics right side together or wrong side together, and one neckband. If you're doing the long sleeves, you'll need cuffs, and I do have a separate video showing the long sleeve cuffs, just in case you need help with that one as well. We're going to open up our back and front body for the shirt, and we're going to put them right sides together, pin or clip matching the shoulder seams. I'm going to be stitching up my Judy Tee mostly with my serger. You can also use a regular sewing machine, no problem. You want your seam allowance to be 1/2 inch on either sewing machine or serger, which means the thread or needle hitting the farthest into your garment is 1/2 inch away from the very edge of your fabric. You can use any stretch stitch for your construction if you're using a sewing machine. Just pick your favorite one. I had my knife turned off on my serger, so you'll see me click it back on. If you're using a serger like me, you're going to want to trim off 1/4 inch so that your seam allowance is at 1/2 inch. So we're just going to stitch these shoulder seams nice and easy. Then you're going to want to press these seams and then open up your bodice, right sides up. You're going to want to take note which one is your front and which one is the back. The front one always has a deeper neckline. Even if you did the higher crew neckline, it's still deeper than the back. We're going to grab our sleeves, whether you did short or long sleeve. I have the short sleeves here. And we're going to make sure that we're putting the double notch towards the back. So here's my double notch, here's my single notch. And when we put them right sides together, we're going to make sure the single notch goes to the front and the double notch goes to the back. The notch at the center is going to align at your shoulder seam. So we're going to pin or clip with right sides together the center notch on the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam. Then starting at the front or the back, we're going to go to the corner and clip at the armpits. Then we're going to ease the sleeve into the arm side, pinning and clipping along the way. This is a dropped shoulder, which actually this is my very first pre-test, and I ended up dropping the shoulder seam a little bit more. So your sleeve cap will be slightly straighter and it will be even easier to ease in. Then we're going to do the same thing on the other armpit, pinning or clipping at the corner and then easing these two opposite curves in. Nothing should really need to stretch here. You do have some slight ease on the sleeve to the arm side, but since they're opposite curves, you really can't tell very much. Then we're just going to stitch the sleeve to the arm side right along here, from armpit to armpit through the shoulder seam. Again, I'll be using my serger. It's at a 1/2 inch seam allowance still. So still trimming off 1/4 inch if you are using a serger like me, and same seam allowance if you're using a sewing machine. One of the reasons I love a dropped shoulder or dolman is because it makes it really quick and easy to sew up for a beginner. Set-in sleeves are a little bit trickier, they're a little harder to ease in, although on a knit t-shirt they're not quite as hard as a woven garment. But if you're a beginner, why not make it as easy on yourself as possible? So the Judy Tee has a nice dropped shoulder with an easy, simple dolman sleeve. I also think it makes fitting much easier for a beginner. So if you're just starting your sewing journey, the Judy Tee is perfect for your first t-shirt. Okay, once we're done with this, we're going to press the seam. If you have heard the myth that you do not need to press when you're sewing knit fabrics, please forget that. Your garment will look so much better if you press after each seam. Of course, I'm going to sew up the other sleeve before I head to my ironing board, but once you stitch them both on, you're definitely going to want to hit them with some steam if your knit fabric can take that, and if not, use a pressing cloth and as high heat as you can. Now, if you did a short sleeve like me, we're going to press a quick memory hem. This is just to make hemming it much easier later on, but I do highly recommend this step. What you're going to do is fold the bottom edge of your sleeve up 3/4 of an inch and give it a nice good press. If you're doing the long sleeve, you don't need to do that. Okay, now we're all pressed up. We're going to unfold that memory hem. That's just for later. It's just much easier to press this hem while it is flat than it is when it's sewn into a little circle of a sleeve. So I do recommend taking the time to do that. You're going to have to press it later on anyways, and it's just so much easier to do it now than after it's sewn up into a circle. So we're going to sew the side seams now. We're going to match it from the bottom of the sleeve, which is very short if you're doing the short sleeve like me, all the way down at the wrist if you're doing the long sleeve, matching the armpits on the front and back, and then down the side seam to the bottom of the hem. You should match perfectly. You shouldn't need to stretch anything. I do always recommend pinning at the top, the armpit, and the bottom, and then pinning in between. Sometimes when you pin from the top all the way to the bottom or the bottom all the way to the top, you accidentally ease in one side to the other and you think they don't match, then really you just accidentally eased some of your fabric. Especially when you have stretchy fabric, it's easy to do that. So I always recommend pinning at the top and then the bottom and then going in between. You can stitch from the armpit down to the bottom or from the bottom up through the armpit to the sleeve. It doesn't matter which one. If you want your seam allowance on your armpit to either go up or down, you can let that decide you, or you can nest those seams, meaning the seam on the front can go up, the seam on the back can go towards the bottom. That helps keep the bulk down a little bit. I tend to usually nest my seams. If I want them going the both way, I tend to go up, down the sleeve. So as you can see, I'm going from the bottom hem up through the armpit, but I do tend to nest my seam allowances there. I push one up and one down so that they just lay a little bit flatter. I'm going to press this seam and then repeat on the other side seam. If this is one of your first knit projects, I recommend picking a knit that doesn't have a ton of stretch. It's easier to work with and easier to get used to knit fabrics if you don't go to the extreme first, or if you're a beginner in general. Super stretchy fabrics tend to be a little bit trickier to work with than something more stable. If you're looking for fabric, cotton tends to be a little bit more stable. A cotton jersey, cotton spandex, or a ribbed knit also tends to be a little bit more stable as well. If you're worried about picking out fabric, I do have a whole video on that here in this Judy Tee playlist. Once we're done and we've pressed the side seams, we're also going to repress our memory hem. I'm sewing with a rib knit here. It holds a press really well, as you can see. But if your fabric didn't hold that press very well, definitely give it a second press again. You're going to press the side seams anyways, so you might as well press the memory hem as well. Now we're going to be sewing the neckband. This is usually thought of one of the trickier parts of learning how to do a knit t-shirt. I'm going to try to help the best I can with all the tips and tricks. I like to cut mine on the fold, my pieces on the fold, and I always do a little notch on the fold line here so that my center is already marked. I also do that on my back and front pieces on the neckline. So my center back, my center front, and the center of my neckband are all already marked from notches. We're just going to stitch our neckband together into a circle, right sides together. You want to press this seam, and then what we're going to do when we're pressing the seam is we're going to fold it wrong sides together vertically, and now it's really going to start looking like a neckband, and we're going to give this a nice press as well. One trick is when you press it, put the fold on the inside and the raw edges on the outside and press it into a circle. So open it into a circle like it's going to lay in the neckline and give it a nice press. It'll make it a little bit easier to lay into the neckline. Here's mine nice and pressed. You can also baste the bottom edges of this neckband together. That will especially help if your fabric is trying to roll. A lot of knit fabrics will roll when stretched, and it'll make it difficult to keep your seam allowance super precise. So you can baste it, or if you have a serger, you can serge the edges. Just don't trim anything off when you are doing the serger. What we're doing now is marking our quarter points. So we're aligning the front and the back, which the back I'm using my seam. The front I marked already. And then finding the even points between. Now we're going to do it on the neckline as well. I again mark the front and back with notches. The shoulder seams are not the quarter points. That's a mistake that a lot of beginning sewists make. You need to align your front and back and then walk your neckline along and find the quarter point, just like we did on the neckband. It will always be towards the front of the shirt. It will always be on the front of the neckband because, again, that front neckline is a little bit deeper than the back. And find it on both sides here, and you can mark it in whatever way you want. I'm using clips. You can use pens. You can use an actual pen or a marker or chalk. Anything you have that will mark that point for you nice and precisely. Now what we're going to do, I like to have my shirt inside out, and I like to slip my neckband inside the shirt. I think that it's the easiest. So I'm matching my front center notches here and pinning or clipping together. I do think pins are more accurate. I also think they're easier for beginners. I have clips here, but I have stitched so many neckbands. I don't need the pin to help me. If you're a beginner, I do think pins are slightly easier and more precise. So if you're struggling with clips as a beginner, try using pins instead. All I'm doing is aligning all these center back of the neckband to the neckline, center front to the center front, and the quarter points to the quarter points. Once we're all pinned and clipped, you'll notice the neckband is much smaller than the neckline. This is not a mistake. You need to stretch your neckband to fit the neckline of the shirt. I like to pin in between these four ones so I'm not stretching as far. So as you can see, I'm taking my shirt and I'm stretching the neckband just until it just is about the same as the neckline, and then I try to clip kind of in between. If this is really difficult for you, what you can do is mark your neckband and neckline into eighths rather than just quarter points if you think that's easier than trying to stretch it evenly. Another thing I like to mention is you want to stretch your neckband a little bit more around the curviest parts of your neckband, which tends to be the bottom front curve. So as you're going around and pinning and clipping, you can keep that in mind. I think it happens naturally, if I'm honest, but that might just be because I've done so many neckbands now. Okay, now that we're all pinned up, you can baste this on, and I cannot recommend this enough for a beginner. If you are struggling with neckbands, or if you're trying to use a fabric that might not be the perfect fabric for a neckband, baste first. Use the full seam allowance. Just use a straight stitch on the longest stitch length. On most sewing machines, it's 5. And you're going to just stretch your neckband just until it fits that neckline. You don't want to stretch so much that you are also stretching the neckline. And we're just going to run this through with just a basting stitch first. And this is going to take away so many problems if you are struggling with neckbands. And here's the reasons why. 1, a sewing machine is much slower if you're trying to stitch on a serger. Yes, sergers make knits easier and quicker, but they move much quicker and it is harder to control. So if you're a beginner, sewing on a sewing machine is most likely much easier because it's a little bit slower. There's also gauges on most sewing machines where you can turn the speed up or down. Now, I'm a pedal to the metal kind of sewist. I always have mine on the fastest speed. But if you're a beginner, you can turn the speed down to help you move a little bit slower and preciser if you're struggling. Another one is if there's a mistake, you can take out a basting stitch, especially on knit fabric, so quick and easy, and is not frustrating. If you go in here with a serger and there's a mistake, it's not going to be fun. Even if you do a quick trick of removing the serger, that means you've already trimmed off 1/4 inch. You're going to have a smaller seam allowance, which I think is more difficult for beginners. So I highly recommend basting here. It's also going to show you and let you know that that neckband is a perfect length for your fabric. Neckbands on every single knit pattern are an guide. They're an estimate or a guide on the kind of fabric that pattern designer chose to draft it from. This pattern, I did not draft it on a traditional ribbing. I drafted it on a jersey knit because I like to use the same fabric, my neckband, as I do on my shirt, and I don't want to always have to go get matching ribbing. So this neckband is slightly looser than a traditional t-shirt neckband that uses ribbing. What basting does is it allows you to see your neckband and make sure it's good. I took it and pressed it. You have to press it to see if it's working out or not. If your neckband is gathering your fabric all along your neckline, you need a little bit longer neckband. You do absolutely need to stretch your neckband to fit. If your neckline is looking wavy, or you put your shirt on and the neckband is standing up almost like a little tiny mock turtleneck away from your body, then you need a smaller neckband. Take it off. It's really easy to take off if you just basted it. All you do on a knit garment is stretch it. Stretch that knit fabric, all those basting stitches will pop, and you'll be free to try again. Make sure you give it a nice press before you try it again though. Now that I know my neckband is looking perfect, I don't have any gathers, I didn't make any little mistakes, it's the perfect length, I'm going to do my final stitch, which is a serger for me. It could be a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine if that's what you're using for construction. at the full 1/2 inch seam allowance again, and then we're going to press it again. I hope all these tips and tricks help on attaching neckbands. It is one of the trickier things to learn sewing with knit fabrics. The two biggest things are pre-press your neckband into a circle, and also to baste it first. Now that it's done, we're gonna make sure all those basting threads are out and then give it a nice press. You can top stitch this. You can top stitch the seam down. This is me just making sure all those basting stitches are out, and there's the thread. See, I just pop the stitches by stretching my fabric, and it's so quick and easy to remove these basting stitches. It's well worth the time to put it in if you are not super comfortable with adding in neckbands. I did this for a long time when I was a beginner sewist, because I learned very quickly that it's much easier and quicker to baste it on than to sew it on and be unhappy with it. So I highly recommend basting your neckband on if you are not very confident that your fabric is the perfect fabric and that you can attach that neckband in one go without any mistakes. To top stitch this neckband, make sure you press. Again, you press the seam allowance away from the neckband and the neckband up away from the shirt. And you can top stitch this with any stretch stitch that you like. You can do it just down below the neckband on the seam allowance, or you can do it straddling this seam allowance, the seam. If you're using a double needle, I'm using a cover stitch here, so I can set my needles as close or as far apart as I want within 3 spaces. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to have a narrow needle setting, so I have my needles close together, and I'm going to put both needles on the bottom of the seam. So I am just top stitching the seam allowance to the shirt. The advantages here are that your seam allowance will never flip. So if that bothers you, if your seam allowance flipping around might bother your skin, you can top stitch it down so it feels a little bit more smooth and flat on your skin. Another thing that this can help is that if your neckband, maybe you didn't quite listen and you didn't baste that neckband on. Okay, I hope you didn't, but maybe you did. And now, even after you pressed your neckband, it's gathering your shirt a little bit. If you really don't want to take that off and make it a little bit longer, what you can do is stretch your neckband as you're top stitching it, and that will help stretch that neckband out just a little bit more and hopefully take care of any gathering that has happened. Now, if you skipped that basting and your neckband is a little bit long, top stitching will only make it worse. I'm so sorry. There's no quick fix to that. The only way to fix a neckband that's a little bit long is you can fold it down more like a faux binding and then top stitch it. But if you want it to look like a traditional neckband, you'll have to take it off, make it a little bit smaller, sew it back on. There's really no other advantages to top stitching. Mostly it's if you like the way it looks. So if you don't like the way it looks, or it's really difficult for you to get it super perfect if you're a beginner, you can skip it, no problem. When I was a beginner sewist and I didn't have a cover stitch machine, I hardly ever top stitched my collars because I just didn't like the way it looked. So it's no problem if you want to skip that. Just make sure you don't skip pressing. Now we're going to hem up the bottom edge of the sleeves. We already pressed it. we're going to try to align our needles right to the edge of that raw folded up edge underneath. I'm using a cover stitch, so I have to stitch from the top side of the fabric. If you're using a sewing machine, you can stitch this from the wrong side and make sure you are keeping your folded edge nice and straight and it's not flipping on you and you are getting that needle right on the edge. I actually think that's an advantage to having a sewing machine over a cover stitch for a beginner. If you're having a really hard time getting a hem that you're happy with, make sure you're giving it a really nice press before you're going to the machine to hem. Another thing that you can do is help stabilize your fabric. On a sewing machine, sometimes it has a hard time hemming it without stretching it out. If you have a walking foot, attaching that to your sewing machine will help that. A walking foot essentially helps glide the fabric through without stretching it. So if you have one, that will help. Another thing you can do is use like a temporary hem stay tape. You want a wash away one. You don't want to use a hem tape that's going to stay in there, a permanent one, because then your fabric would never stretch again and it would look a little funky as well. But you can iron in a temporary hem tape or stay tape. You can also use a glue stick as long as you are sure it's a machine safe glue stick. You don't want to use just any old glue stick. They have them at craft stores that are machine safe, sewing safe glue sticks. You can use that to help glue down your hem. You can also use like a basting spray that's generally used for quilting. This one is a little harder to keep nice and tidy only on your hem. You might end up with a pretty sticky shirt all around. But all these things will help stabilize your fabric as it's going through. One other old trick is if you're using a really thin, stretchy fabric, which I don't recommend if you're a beginner, but you're going to have to try it eventually. So maybe you're not a beginner, but you're still having a really hard time hemming your first super stretchy, thin knit fabric. You can also feed it in with toilet paper or tissue paper on the underside. It'll help stabilize the fabric so it doesn't stretch out as it's going in or get stuck, getting pulled into the machine, getting eaten by your machine. And then once you're done, you just rip it off. Okay, all of those are my tips and tricks. If you're using a more stable knit like me, I have a rib knit, all that's needed is to pre-press it. That's it. And then don't stretch it as it's going through. Let the machine guide it through nice and easy. And here's the bottom side. Again, our needle, you want the needle up against that raw edge underneath. So right at 3/4 of an inch is where you want your needle hitting. You do need to use a stretch stitch for your hems. If you really want the look of a cover stitch and you don't have a cover stitch, you can use a double needle on a regular sewing machine. If you don't have a double needle, you can use any stretch stitch like a zigzag. One of my very favorites for a sewing machine is a triple step zigzag. It takes a little bit longer than a normal zigzag because it takes 3 steps for each zig and each zag, but it's super stretchy. I like the way it looks. It's just one of my favorites. But you can take a little piece of your fabric and just test it out. See which one you like the best. You want a stitch that stretches as much as your fabric. So if you have something super stretchy, you need a super stretchy stitch. If you have a knit fabric that barely stretches at all, you really don't need a very stretchy stitch. You just want to make sure when your knit fabric gets stretched as it's getting pulled on and off, or maybe a little kid tugging at your shirt, your seams don't pop because your stitches don't stretch as much as your knit fabric. So just take a little piece and test out all the ones that you like the look of. There we go. One more press and the shirt is all done. I hope you had so much fun sewing up the Judy Tee with me. I hope I helped with all my tips and tricks, and I can't wait to see yours.